What these hardened killers didn't realize was that the silent stranger before them had sent more men to their graves with that single blade than all the gunslingers west of the Mississippi combined. The dust-filled wind howled through crows. Passers 5 outlaws surrounded a lone traveler, their sneers cutting through the evening air as they mocked his peculiar attire, a weathered duster hiding an ancient katana at his side. Thunder rolled across the iron-gray sky as Jake Deadeye, Harrison's gang, circled their prey outside the Crow's Pass saloon. The town had seen its share of violence since the silver mines dried up, but something about this evening felt different. The stranger had appeared out of nowhere, his boots making no sound on the wooden planks of the sidewalk, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen too many storms. "Well, boys, looks like we got ourselves one of them fancy sword dancers from back east," Jake drawled, his hand resting on his prized Colt revolver. The other outlaws laughed, spread out in a practiced formation that had trapped many victims before. The stranger didn't move, didn't speak. His only reaction was a slight adjustment of his stance, so subtle most would have missed it. But old Tom, the saloon keeper watching from his doorway, had seen enough fighters in his day to recognize the shift for what it was: a wolf preparing to strike. Crow's Pass had changed since the glory days of the Silver Rush, where once miners and merchants had filled the streets with the bustle of commerce. Now only desperate men remained, drawn to the dying town like vultures to carrion. Jake Harrison and his gang had moved in 3 months ago, declaring themselves the law in a place that had long since forgotten what law meant. The town's former sheriff, a good man named William Carter, had mysteriously disappeared shortly after Harrison's arrival. His badge now gleamed mockingly on Harrison's chest, a symbol of how far Crow's Pass had fallen. The townsfolk whispered about Carter's fate, but none dared speak too loudly. Harrison's gang had ways of dealing with loose tongues. The evening sun cast long shadows across the empty street as curious faces peered from behind dusty windows. They'd seen this scene play out before, Harrison's gang circling some unfortunate traveler, demanding toll money for safe passage through their territory. Usually it ended with either a robbery or a funeral, depending on how stubborn the victim proved to be. "Ain't polite to ignore folks when they're talking to you, stranger," spat Rattler, Harrison's right-hand man, named for the snake tattooed around his neck, especially when they're being so friendly-like. The stranger finally moved, his head tilting slightly to reveal eyes that seemed to reflect the storm clouds gathering above. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the evening air. "I seek only passage through your town. Nothing more." This brought another round of laughter from the gang. Snake-Eye Pete, the youngest of the outlaws, drew his gun with practiced showmanship. "Hear that, boys? He seeks passage. Well, passage round here costs whatever we say it costs, and today I'm thinking that fancy sword might make for proper payment." Old Tom watched the scene unfold, his weathered hands gripping the doorframe of his saloon. He'd been in Crow's Pass longer than most, had watched it rise with the silver strike and fall with the mine's collapse. But something about this confrontation felt different from the countless others he'd witnessed. The stranger's stillness wasn't born of fear. It was the calm of a master who had already seen every possible way this confrontation could end. The stranger's hand didn't move toward his blade. Instead, he reached slowly into his coat and produced a small leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. "Will this suffice?" Harrison's eyes gleamed with greed, but there was something else there too, a predatory anticipation that suggested the money had never been the point. "Maybe we ain't interested in your coins, swordman. Maybe we just want to see if all them stories about Eastern blade dancers are true." The air seemed to grow heavier, like the moment before lightning strikes. In the saloon's shadows, Sarah Carter, the missing sheriff's daughter, watched with barely contained rage. She'd been biding her time since her father's disappearance, waiting for something, anything, that might change the balance of power in Crow's Pass. There was something about this stranger that gave her a glimmer of hope, though she couldn't say why. "I should warn you," the stranger said softly, his words carrying a weight that made even Harrison's sneer falter for a moment. "The stories you've heard, they don't do justice to the truth." As if in response, the first drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the dusty street like nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in Crow's Pass. The wind picked up, carrying whispers of legends about swordmasters from the east, tales of men who could move faster than bullets and cut through steel like paper. But legends were just legends, or so the outlaws believed, not knowing they were about to learn otherwise. The tension in Crow's Pass snapped like a dry twig when Harrison made his move. His hand dropped to his revolver with the speed that had earned him his nickname. But the stranger was already in motion. What happened next would be debated in saloons across 3 territories for years to come. Some swore they never saw the sword leave its sheath. Others claimed they caught a flash of steel so bright it left after-images dancing in their vision. All anyone knew for certain was that suddenly Harrison was stumbling backward, his gun belt falling apart where it had been cleanly severed, his prized Colt hitting the mud unfired. Snake Eye Pete's jaw dropped as he stared at his own holster, now split cleanly in 2, his weapon lying useless in the dirt. He hadn't even seen the stranger move. What in the devil's name? Rattler, living. Up to his name was the quickest to recover. He drew and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet cutting through the space where the stranger had been standing. But the stranger wasn't there anymore. He was behind Rattler, sword resheathed, moving with a grace that seemed to defy natural law. "Impossible," Rattler whispered, watching his gun barrel slide from its handle, cut as cleanly as if it were made of butter. The remaining gang members backed away, their confident sneers replaced by looks of growing terror. Old Tom had seen his share of gunfights, but this was something else entirely. The stranger's movements weren't just fast. They were otherworldly. Each step seemed to bend space itself, as if the very air was helping him move. Sarah Carter leaned forward in the saloon's shadows, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. From his vantage point behind the bar, old Tom noticed something peculiar about the stranger's footwork. Where the rain had turned the street to mud, the stranger's boots should have left deep impressions. Instead, he seemed to glide across the surface, barely disturbing the earth beneath. It reminded Tom of stories his grandmother used to tell, tales of warriors who had learned to walk between the worlds. "You're him, ain't you?" Harrison's voice had lost its swagger, replaced by a trembling note of recognition. "The one they talk about in Deadwood. The ghost blade that cut down 20 men without spilling a drop of blood." The stranger adjusted his hat slightly, revealing eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. "You have me confused with someone else. I'm merely a traveler seeking passage." "Like hell you are," Rattler snarled, pulling a hidden derringer from his boot. "No man moves like that, no natural man." He fired twice in rapid succession. The stranger's sword moved in an arc that seemed to trace symbols in the air. Both bullets fell to the ground, split cleanly in half. The rain was falling harder now, but where it touched the stranger, it seemed to part around him, as if nature itself acknowledged him as something set apart. Through the saloon's grimy windows, more townspeople had gathered to watch the confrontation. Among them was Doc Morrison, who had treated enough gunshot wounds to know that what he was witnessing defied everything he understood about combat. The stranger's blade didn't just cut, it seemed to pass through metal as if it weren't there at all. "I warned you," the stranger said softly. "The stories don't do justice to the truth, but you still haven't asked the most important question." Harrison, still backing away, took the bait. "What question?" "Why I'm really here." The stranger's voice carried an edge now sharp as his blade. Sheriff Carter's daughter isn't the only one who's been waiting for this moment, Sarah gasped from her hiding place. The stranger hadn't even glanced in her direction, but somehow he'd known she was there, known who she was. Harrison's face went pale as death. "You're here for—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Justice," the stranger completed it for him. William Carter was more than just a sheriff. He was part of something larger, something you and your kind couldn't begin to understand. And now it's time for accounts to be settled. The stranger's sword began to emit a subtle blue glow, visible even in the growing storm. Old Tom rubbed his eyes, certain he must be seeing things. But Sarah Carter saw it too, and suddenly she remembered stories her father used to tell her, tales of ancient warriors who protected more than just law and order. They protected the very boundaries between worlds. The light from the blade cast strange shadows on the surrounding buildings, shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. Doc Morrison found himself recalling peculiar passages in his grandfather's journals, descriptions of healers, who could see the lines between what was and what could be, who understood that reality itself was more fluid than most people imagined. Thunder cracked overhead, and in that instant, everything in Crow's Pass changed. The line between legend and reality, between the world everyone knew and the world that existed in shadow, began to blur. And at the center of it all stood a stranger with a glowing sword, about to show these outlaws why some legends are better left undisturbed. The wind picked up, carrying whispers of ancient power, and those who watched from the safety of their buildings felt something shift in the air, as if the very fabric of their world was being pulled aside to reveal something older, something that had always existed just beyond the edge of normal perception. The real battle for Crow's Pass was about to begin, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The stranger's glowing blade cast ethereal shadows across Crow's Pass as Harrison and his gang backed away, their earlier bravado replaced by primal fear. But it wasn't just the sword that made them retreat. It was the way reality itself seemed to bend around its wielder, like ripples in a pond, disturbed by something ancient stirring beneath the surface. "Sheriff Carter knew what was coming," the stranger said, his voice carrying an otherworldly resonance now. "He was one of us, a watcher. That's why you were sent to silence him, wasn't it, Harrison? Or should I call you by your true name? Thomas Blackwood, servant of the Shadow Court." Harrison's face contorted, his human disguise seeming to slip for just a moment, revealing something darker underneath. "How do you know that name?" he snarled, his voice taking on an inhuman edge that made several townspeople stumble back from their windows. "Because I was there 50 years ago, when your masters first tried to breach the boundaries." The stranger removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked hair and eyes that glowed with the same ethereal light as his blade. "I am Kenshin Yamamoto, though some know me as the Twilight Blade. I'm a guardian of the ancient ways, and I have come to seal the breach you plan to open." Sarah Carter stepped out from the saloon's shadows, her father's old journal clutched in her hands. "The mine," she said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's what Dad discovered, isn't it? Why they killed him?" Kenshin nodded slowly. The silver mines of Crow's Pass were never just about mineral wealth. They're focal points, places where the boundaries between worlds grow thin. Your father found evidence that the Shadow Court was planning to use them to create a gateway. Old Tom moved to stand beside Sarah, his weathered face set with determination. "William showed me something in those mines, couple months before he disappeared. Symbols carved into the rock, older than any mining operation. Said they were some kind of warning." "They're more than warnings," Kenshin replied, his sword humming with power. "They're seals placed there by the first guardians to contain what lies below. But they're weakening, and the Shadow Court knows it." Harrison, or Blackwood, laughed. The sound like breaking glass. His gang began to change, their human forms melting away to reveal twisted shadows barely contained in physical form. "You're too late, Guardian. The alignment comes tonight, and the seals are already failing. Even your vaunted blade can't stop what's about to happen." The rain intensified, but now it fell in unnatural patterns, creating symbols on the muddy street that glowed with a sickly light. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something ancient and wrong. "You're right about one thing," Kenshin said, shifting into a stance that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. "My blade alone can't stop this, but I'm not alone, am I, Sarah Carter?" Sarah's hands trembled as she opened her father's journal. Inside, pages of careful notes detailed the symbols in the mines. But more importantly, they contained something else: exercises, forms, techniques passed down through generations of watchers. "Dad was training me," she whispered. "All those lessons he called self-defense. He was preparing me to become a watcher too." Kenshin nodded. "Your father knew this day might come. That's why he chose you as his successor. The power runs in your blood, Sarah. It always has." From his belt, Kenshin produced a second sword, smaller than his own but marked with similar symbols. "This belonged to your father. He entrusted it to me for safekeeping, knowing I would find you when the time was right." The twisted forms that had once been Harrison's gang began to spread out, their movements no longer constrained by human limitations. But their attention wasn't on Kenshin anymore. They were watching Sarah with newfound wariness. "The girl knows nothing," Blackwood spat. "She can't possibly." Sarah's hand closed around her father's sword, and immediately the blade blazed to life with the same blue fire as Kenshin's. The symbols carved into its surface began to rotate, responding to something in her blood, something that had been waiting to awaken. "I think," she said, her voice steady, despite the power coursing through her, "you've underestimated my family for the last time." Thunder crashed overhead, but now it seemed to respond to the power gathering in the street below. Two guardians stood against the encroaching darkness, one ancient and tested, one newly awakened but burning bright with potential. The true battle for Crow's Pass was about to begin, and with it, a war that had been brewing beneath the surface of reality for centuries would finally break into the open. The rain continued to fall, but now it seemed to dance around the two glowing blades, as if even the elements recognized that something extraordinary was about to unfold in this small frontier town. The boundary between the world everyone knew and the world that existed in shadow was about to be tested, and everything hung in the balance. The twisted shadows that had once been Harrison's gang retreated into the deepening gloom of Crow's Pass, leaving Kenshin and Sarah standing in the rain-soaked street, their glowing blades pushing back the unnatural darkness. Old Tom emerged from his saloon with a lantern, its normal light seeming pale and inadequate compared to the ethereal glow of the guardian swords. "The mines," Sarah said, her father's blade humming with newfound power in her hands. "We need to see what Dad discovered." She opened his journal again, pointing to a series of carefully drawn maps. "These tunnels, they form patterns, don't they?" Kenshin nodded, studying the diagrams. "Your father was more perceptive than most watchers. He didn't just see the individual tunnels. He saw how they connected. The entire mining operation was guided by something older, something that whispered to the miners in their dreams, encouraging them to dig in specific patterns." Doc Morrison approached cautiously, his medical bag clutched in his hands. "I treated those miners near the end. They talked about dreams, geometric patterns, symbols that made their eyes hurt just thinking about them. I thought it was cave gas or maybe silver fever, but it was them," Old Tom interrupted, his weathered face grave. "The things below, William showed me just before he disappeared, took me down to the deepest tunnel, where the walls—" He shuddered at the memory. The walls weren't just rock anymore. They moved like something was trying to push through from the other side. Kenshin's sword traced patterns in the air, leaving trails of blue fire that seemed to form maps of their own. The Shadow Court didn't choose Crow's Pass by accident. This place sits at the intersection of what the first Guardians called lines, channels of power that run through the earth itself, the silver veins that brought the miners here. They're not just mineral deposits, they're the physical manifestation of these power lines. Sarah studied her father's journal with new understanding. That's why the mining company's surveys never made sense. The richest veins didn't follow any geological logic. They formed patterns like the ones we're seeing now. The wind carried whispers of unnatural voices as Kenshin led them toward the mine entrance. The wooden support beams were carved with symbols that most had dismissed as miners' graffiti, but now Sarah could see them for what they really were. Wards, placed there by generations of watchers trying to contain what lurked below. Your father wasn't the first watcher to guard this place, Kenshin explained as they descended into the earth. The position has been passed down through different families, different traditions, each adding their own layers of protection. The Native Americans who first lived here had their own guardians. Before them, others kept watch. The names and methods changed, but the purpose remained the same. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with more than just mineral dust. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, taking forms that seemed to defy natural law. Sarah's blade responded to each disturbance, its glow intensifying as if warning of danger. The boundary between worlds, she said, remembering fragments of her father's teachings. It's not just weaker here, it's almost gone, isn't it? Kenshin's expression was grim. The Shadow Court has been working for centuries to weaken it, using the miners' greed as a tool. Each tunnel they dug, each blast of dynamite, they weren't just extracting silver, they were creating a vast pattern, a key of sorts, designed to unlock something that should remain forever sealed. Old Tom's lantern light revealed more symbols carved into the tunnel walls, some fresh, others worn smooth by time. William spent weeks down here, copying these marks, trying to understand their meaning. Said something about a convergence, a time when the stars would align with the patterns in the earth. The convergence comes tonight, Kenshin confirmed. When it does, the boundary will be at its weakest. If the Shadow Court succeeds in completing their key, what lies beyond will have a chance to break through. They reached a chamber where multiple tunnels converged. Here, the walls were completely covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The air itself felt wrong, as if reality was stretched tissue paper thin. "This is where I found him," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "Dad, I mean, not his body, that was never found, but his badge, his journal, and this." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a piece of silver ore, unlike any Kenshin had seen before. Symbols similar to those on their blades had formed naturally within the metal itself. "A message," Kenshin breathed, taking the ore carefully. "Your father found something so important he used the very power of this place to preserve it. The question is, can we decode it before the Shadow Court completes their ritual?" The chamber seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy as they studied the silver ore, each pulse bringing another whisper, another shadow that shouldn't exist. The true scope of what they faced was becoming clear, and with it, the realization that they were running out of time. The boundary between worlds was failing, and all that stood between Crow's Pass and unimaginable horror was a veteran guardian, a newly awakened watcher, and the mysterious message left behind by a man who had given his life to protect a secret that was about to be revealed. The chamber's unnatural silence shattered as a sound like tearing reality filled the minds. The symbols on the walls began to pulse with sickly light, and from the deeper tunnels came the echo of approaching footsteps that seemed to fall in impossible rhythms. "They're here," Kenshin said, his blade blazing brighter in response to the growing darkness. "The Shadow Court's true forms. This is what your father saw before the end." From the tunnels emerged figures that seemed to be made of living shadow, their forms shifting between human and something far more ancient. Leading them was Harrison Blackwood, but his transformation was now complete. Where a man had stood now, towered a being of pure darkness, wearing reality like an ill-fitting coat. "The boundary weakens," Blackwood's voice echoed with undertones that hurt the mind to hear. "Can you feel it, Guardians? The walls between worlds grow thin. Soon our masters will walk again in this realm." Sarah's blade moved instinctively into a defensive position, the forms her father had taught her flowing naturally now. "Your masters were sealed away for a reason," she said, surprised by the authority in her own voice. "The first Guardians understood what their presence would do to our world." "Their presence?" Blackwood laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Their presence is what gave your world form, little watcher. Before them, reality was fluid, unlimited. They taught humanity to dream, to imagine, to break free from the prison of physical law. They taught humanity to fear," Kenshin countered, his sword tracing symbols in the air that seemed to stabilize the wavering reality around them. "To wake screaming from nightmares of geometries that shouldn't exist. The boundaries were created to protect both sides, to give form to formless chaos and prevent it from destroying itself through unlimited possibility." The shadow beings began to spread out through the chamber, their movements following patterns that made old Tom's eyes water just trying to follow them. Doc Morrison found himself backing against a wall, his scientific mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "The silver veins," Sarah said suddenly, understanding dawning as she looked at the ore in her hand. "They're not just power lines. They're cage bars. The entire mine is a prison, isn't it?" "Very good." Blackwood's form rippled with dark amusement. "Your father figured it out too, just before we showed him what true freedom from physical law looks like. Would you like to—" "See, we kept him, you know. In a place where time and space have no meaning, he's still screaming. Still—" Sarah's blade flared with blue fire, responding to her surge of anger. The symbols along its length began to rotate, matching patterns on the chamber walls. "You're lying. Dad found something else in these mines. Something that terrified you, enough to break your cover." The shadow beings paused in their movement, and for a moment something like fear flickered across their fluid forms. Kenshin noticed their reaction and moved closer to Sarah, his own blade harmonizing with hers. "The silver ore," he said quietly. "It's not just a message, it's a key. Not to open the boundaries, but to reinforce them. Your father found a way to strengthen the prison." Blackwood's form suddenly expanded, filling the chamber with darkness that seemed to devour light itself. "Enough. The alignment comes, and with it, our chance to undo the chains that bind existence to mere physical law. Kill them all, but bring me that ore." The shadow beings surged forward, their forms stretching and twisting in ways that defied comprehension. But Sarah and Kenshin were ready. Their blades moved in perfect synchronization, leaving trails of blue fire that seemed to cut through the very fabric of reality. Where their swords struck the shadow beings, reality itself seemed to crystallize, forcing the fluid forms into more solid states. The shadows screamed in voices that echoed through multiple dimensions, finding themselves bound by the very physical laws they sought to destroy. "The boundaries," Kenshin called out as he fought. "They're not just divisions between worlds, they're definitions. They give meaning to existence by limiting infinite possibility into comprehensible form." Sarah's blade danced through forms her father had taught her, each movement now carrying new significance. She wasn't just fighting with a sword. She was rewriting reality itself, reinforcing the boundaries that gave existence structure. Old Tom and Doc Morrison pressed themselves against the chamber walls as the battle raged, witnessing a conflict that existed on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The shadow beings fought with weapons that changed form with every strike, but the Guardians' blades remained constant, their light a beacon of stability in a sea of chaos. The chamber itself seemed to pulse with power as the battle continued, the symbols on the walls responding to each clash of physics defying combat. The boundary between worlds grew thinner with each passing moment, and through the growing gaps, hints of something vast and impossible began to seep through. The first whispers of the Shadow Court's true masters stirring in their ancient prison. The first major battle for Crow's Pass was fully joined, and its outcome would determine far more than just the fate of a small mining town. The very nature of reality hung in the balance, and the night was still young. The battle in the mine chamber had reached a temporary stalemate, with Sarah and Kenshin holding their position against the shadow beings. As reality continued to waver around them, Kenshin began to speak, his voice carrying ancient knowledge that seemed to stabilize the very air. The boundaries between worlds weren't created by chance, he explained, his blade maintaining a defensive arc of blue fire. They emerged from necessity when the first humans began to understand that unlimited possibility wasn't freedom. It was chaos. Sarah's blade harmonized with his as she remembered passages from her father's journal. The silver in these mines, she said, it's not just mineral deposits. It's like crystallized reality. Precisely. Kenshin's eyes never left the circling shadow beings as he continued. The first Guardians discovered that certain materials could act as anchors, helping to define and maintain the boundaries between what is and what could be. Silver, with its natural purifying properties, became one of their most powerful tools. Old Tom, pressed against the chamber wall, spoke up. That's why the Shadow Court corrupted the mining operation. They weren't just weakening the boundaries, they were removing the anchors. The shadow beings hissed at this revelation, their forms rippling with barely contained rage. Blackwood's voice cut through the darkness. The anchors are chains, nothing more. They restrict the infinite potential of existence to mere physical law. Physical law is what gives existence meaning, Kenshin countered. Before the boundaries, reality was a nightmare of unlimited possibility. Nothing had form because everything was possible simultaneously. The first Guardians didn't create the boundaries to imprison. They created them to preserve. Sarah studied the symbols on her father's blade, seeing them with new understanding. These marks, they're not just decorative, are they? They're like mathematical formulas for reality itself. Each tradition of Guardians developed their own symbols, Kenshin confirmed. Eastern, Western, Native American, different approaches to the same fundamental truth. The boundaries must be maintained or everything dissolves into chaos. Doc Morrison, his scientific mind racing, ventured a question. But how do these boundaries actually work? What's the mechanism? Imagine reality as a vast ocean, Kenshin said, his sword tracing patterns that seemed to illustrate his words. Without boundaries, every possibility exists simultaneously, a state of infinite potential but zero actualization. The boundaries are like ice crystals forming in water, giving shape and structure to infinite possibility. The shadow beings writhed at this explanation, their forms becoming more agitated. Your analogies are chains, Blackwood snarled. The masters understand that true freedom lies in unbounded existence. And yet, Sarah observed, you maintain humanoid forms. If you truly believed in unlimited possibility, why restrict yourselves to any form at all? This struck a nerve. The shadow beings' shapes flickered, as if struggling with an uncomfortable truth. Kenshin pressed the advantage, not with his blade but with wisdom. Even chaos needs definition to exist, he said. The Shadow Court's masters aren't fighting against all boundaries. They're fighting against the ones that prevent them from imposing their will on reality. They don't want freedom, they want control. The chamber's symbols pulsed in response to this truth, and Sarah felt something shift in her understanding. That's why there are different traditions of guardians, isn't it? Because reality needs multiple perspectives to remain stable. Kenshin nodded. The boundaries aren't just walls between worlds. They're agreements between different ways of seeing reality. Eastern philosophy, Western logic, Native American harmony with nature. Each tradition contributes to maintaining the balance. The silver ore, Old Tom interjected, pointing to the piece in Sarah's hand. William discovered something about these traditions, didn't he? Something about how they work together. Your father, Kenshin said to Sarah, found evidence that the first guardians weren't divided by tradition. They understood that the strongest boundaries are those that incorporate multiple perspectives. The shadow beings had grown eerily still, their forms seeming to absorb the darkness around them. Blackwood's voice carried a new note of urgency. The alignment approaches. Soon, none of this will matter. The masters will show you what reality looks like without your precious boundaries. But Sarah had seen something in the chamber's symbols, something that connected with the marks on her father's blade and the patterns in the silver ore. The different traditions weren't just separate approaches to maintaining reality. They were parts of a larger whole, like facets of a crystal. That's what Dad discovered, she breathed. The boundaries aren't failing because they're too weak. They're failing because we've been maintaining them separately instead of together. Kenshin's blade flared brighter as understanding dawned. The shadow beings backed away slightly, sensing a shift in the balance of power. The truth about the boundaries and how to reinforce them was finally emerging from centuries of divided knowledge. The revelations about the boundaries' true nature echoed through the mind chamber, but they were interrupted by a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. The walls shimmered, reality growing thinner with each passing moment. The alignment, Blackwood's shadow form expanded, seeming to absorb the darkness around him. It begins. Soon the masters will be free, and all your understanding will mean nothing. Sarah gripped her father's blade tighter, feeling the power pulse through its ancient symbols. You still haven't told us what really happened to my father, what he found that frightened you so much. The shadow beings rippled with dark amusement, but Sarah noticed something else, a flicker of unease beneath their confident facades. Kenshin stepped forward, his sword casting blue fire that pushed back the encroaching darkness. They're afraid, he said quietly, not just of what William Carter discovered, but of what he passed on before they could stop him. Old Tom moved closer to Sarah, his weathered face set with determination. Your father came to me the night before he disappeared, made me swear to protect something, though I didn't understand its importance then. From beneath his vest, he withdrew a silver chain with a small pendant, a piece of worked silver inscribed with symbols that matched those on the chamber walls. The shadow beings recoiled visibly at the sight of the pendant. Blackwood's form wavered, reality distorting around him. "The key of harmony," he hissed. "Impossible! We searched his body, his house, everything." "Dad knew you were coming," Sarah realized, reaching for the pendant. As her fingers closed around it, her blade blazed brighter, responding to some resonance between the ancient symbols. He distributed his discoveries, didn't he? Pieces of the puzzle, hidden with people he trusted. Doc Morrison stepped forward, now emboldened by the revelation. The treatments he asked me to document, they weren't just for miners' injuries. He was having me record the effects of prolonged exposure to the boundary distortions, creating a medical history of what happens when reality starts to break down. "And the maps he had me draw," Old Tom added. not just of the mine tunnels, but of the town itself, the way the buildings were laid out, the paths people took most often. He said something about natural patterns reinforcing artificial ones. Kenshin nodded, understanding dawning in his ancient eyes. William Carter wasn't just a watcher. He was trying to prove that the boundaries between worlds aren't maintained by guardians alone. They're strengthened by every conscious being that believes in ordered reality. The chamber trembled again, and through the deepest tunnel came a sound that shouldn't exist, a harmony of impossible notes that made the air itself vibrate with wrongness. The shadow beings began to move with new purpose, forming patterns that seemed to draw the darkness together. The alignment progresses. Blackwood's voice carried triumphant malice. Your realizations come too late. The masters stir in their prison, and soon... Prison. Sarah interrupted, something clicking in her mind as she studied the pendant. No, not a prison. These symbols, they're not about containment. They're about separation, distinction. The boundaries aren't cage bars, they're definitions. The girl begins to understand, came a new voice, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. From the shadows emerged a figure that seemed to bend reality around it. A woman in ceremonial Native American dress, her own blade glowing with the same blue fire as the others. Rachel Thunderhawk, Kenshin greeted her with respect. I wondered when you would reveal yourself. The time for hiding is past, Rachel replied, her blade adding its light to theirs. William Carter was right. The boundaries are not walls between worlds. They are the very thing that gives worlds their meaning. Without distinction, without definition, everything becomes nothing. The shadow beings hissed at her words, but they kept their distance. 3 guardian blades now illuminated the chamber, their combined light creating patterns that seemed to stabilize the wavering reality around them. Sarah looked from her father's blade to his pendant to the symbols that covered the walls. Everything was connected. The mine's layout, the town's architecture, the daily patterns of its inhabitants. Her father hadn't just been protecting the boundaries. He'd been trying to show how they were naturally reinforced by the very act of living in an ordered universe. That's why you killed him, she said to Blackwood, her voice carrying new authority. Not because he found a way to strengthen the boundaries, but because he discovered they're already being strengthened by everyone, every day, just by believing in a world that makes sense. The chamber shuddered again, and through the gaps, in reality came whispers in languages that predated human consciousness. The true battle for Crow's Pass was about to begin, but now the stakes were clear. This wasn't just about preventing an invasion from another world. It was about preserving the very thing that made existence meaningful. The ability to distinguish what is from what could be. As Sarah raised her father's blade, she felt the weight of this understanding settle into her bones. The boundaries between worlds weren't just mystical constructs maintained by ancient warriors. They were the fundamental principles that allowed consciousness itself to exist. And she was now part of an ancient lineage, sworn to protect not just reality, but the very concept of meaning itself. The chamber erupted into chaos as the alignment reached its peak. The walls between worlds grew so thin that other realities began to bleed through. Impossible geometries and colors that shouldn't exist twisted through the air. The combined light of 3 guardian blades barely held back the encroaching darkness. The masters awaken. Blackwood's voice carried a note of religious fervor. His shadow form expanded, filling the chamber with darkness that seemed to devour light itself. The other shadow beings began a chant in languages that predated human speech, their words making the very air vibrate with wrongness. The silver lines, Rachel Thunderhawk called out, her blade tracing protective symbols in the air. They're not just power conduits, they're the original boundaries laid down by the first peoples who understood what lurked beyond normal reality. Sarah studied the chamber walls with newfound understanding. The silver veins weren't randomly distributed. They formed intricate patterns, like a vast circuit designed to channel and contain otherworldly energies. But now those patterns were breaking down, corrupted by decades of mining operations guided by the Shadow Court. "Your father saw this coming," Kenshin said, as he deflected a tendril of pure darkness with his blade. "That's why he encoded his discoveries in ways they couldn't understand. The pendant, the medical records, the town layouts, they're all parts of a larger pattern." The ground beneath their feet began to crack, revealing depths that seemed to go on forever. Through these fissures came whispers that spoke of infinite possibility, of existence unbound by physical law. Old Tom and Doc Morrison pressed themselves against the chamber walls, watching in horror as reality itself began to unravel. "The key of harmony," Sarah said, looking at her father's pendant. "It's not just a key, it's a template, a pattern, for how different aspects of reality can work together without losing their distinct nature." "Like your garden," Old Tom called out, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Desert plants and cultivated flowers, growing together but remaining separate, natural boundaries that strengthen each other instead of fighting." The shadow being's chant reached a crescendo, and suddenly the deepest tunnel erupted with darkness deeper than mere absence of light. Through this darkness came forms that shouldn't exist, vast, geometrically impossible shapes that hurt the mind to perceive. "The Master's return," Blackwood's voice carried triumph and madness in equal measure. "Look upon true freedom, Guardians. Look upon existence unbound by your precious boundaries." But Sarah was looking at something else. As reality wavered and buckled, she saw how the town above unconsciously reinforced natural boundaries through its daily patterns. The paths people walked, the ways they organized their lives, all of it created structure, definition, meaning. Dad wasn't trying to create new boundaries, she realized. He was trying to show us they're already there, in everything we do, every choice, every distinction we make. They all help maintain the separation between what is and what could be. "The girl speaks truth," Rachel confirmed, her blade moving in patterns that seemed to stabilize the wavering air. "The first peoples understood this. They didn't build walls between worlds. They lived in ways that naturally reinforced the boundaries." A sound like reality tearing filled the chamber as the masters of the Shadow Court began to manifest. Their forms were impossible to comprehend directly. The mind could only process pieces, fragments that suggested shapes that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. "This is what existed before the boundaries," Kenshin said grimly. "Infinite, possibility, unlimited potential, and absolutely nothing real or meaningful. Without distinction, without definition, existence itself becomes impossible." The chamber's symbols pulsed with sickly light as the masters pushed against the thinning boundaries. Each pulse brought more impossible geometries, more whispers of a reality where physical law meant nothing. The very concepts of up and down, here and there, began to lose meaning. Sarah raised her father's blade, feeling the power pulse through its ancient symbols. The pendant at her throat blazed with matching light, and suddenly she understood what needed to be done. The boundaries couldn't be reinforced through force alone. They needed to be strengthened by conscious choice, by willing acceptance of necessary limitations. "Everyone," she called out, "focus on what's real, on what makes sense. Your memories, your experiences, everything that defines your world. The boundaries aren't just magical barriers, they're the product of every mind that believes in ordered reality." The crisis point had arrived. As the masters of the Shadow Court pushed against the last remnants of ordered reality, everything hung in the balance. The next few moments would determine not just the fate of Crow's Pass, but the very nature of existence itself. Above ground, the town's inhabitants suddenly found themselves gripped by strange dreams. Dreams of boundaries, of distinctions, of the precious gift of defined reality. Without knowing why, they began to hold tighter to what they knew was real, unconsciously, reinforcing the very boundaries that kept chaos at bay. The final battle for reality itself was about to begin, and its outcome would depend not just on the strength of guardian blades, but on humanity's fundamental need for a world that made sense. The chamber vibrated with otherworldly energies as 3 guardian blades held back the encroaching chaos. Through the thinning boundaries, the masters of the Shadow Court pushed reality itself to its breaking point. But Sarah's call to focus on what was real had sparked something unexpected. "The town," Rachel said, her blade moving in harmony with the others. "Can you feel it? The people above? They're responding, even if they don't know why." Kenshin nodded, his ancient eyes seeing patterns invisible to others. Every conscious mind that believes in ordered reality becomes an anchor point. William Carter understood this. It's why he spent so much time studying the town's daily patterns. The shadow beings writhed in frustration as their master's manifestation seemed to falter. Blackwood's form rippled with rage. "Your pathetic human minds cannot comprehend true freedom. The masters will show you what reality looks like without your artificial constraints." But something was changing. The symbols on the chamber walls began to pulse with new energy, responding to the collective will of the town above. Every person who chose to believe in a world that made sense, every mind that accepted the necessity of boundaries, they all contributed to strengthening the fabric of reality. Sarah felt power flowing through her father's blade, different from before. It wasn't just ancient magic now, it was connected to something deeper, something fundamentally human. "The 3 traditions," she said suddenly, "they're not just different ways of protecting the boundaries. They're different ways of understanding why boundaries matter." "Eastern philosophy," Kenshin said, his blade tracing patterns that spoke of balance and harmony. "The understanding that limitation creates meaning." "Native wisdom," Rachel added, her movements flowing like water. "The knowledge that all things are connected, but must remain distinct to have purpose." "And Western thought," Sarah completed, thinking of her father's careful documentation. "The drive to understand, to categorize, to find patterns in chaos." The masters pushed harder against reality's thinning walls, their impossible geometries threatening to overwhelm normal space-time. But now they faced more than just 3 guardian blades. Every person in Crow's Pass had become part of an unconscious alliance, their very belief in ordered reality strengthening the boundaries. Old Tom stepped forward, holding up his lantern. Its normal light seemed to take on new significance, pushing back the impossible shadows. "William used to say that even the simplest things matter. The way we build our houses, arrange our streets, it all helps maintain order." Doc Morrison joined him, his medical bag clutched tight. "The human body itself depends on boundaries. Cell walls, organ systems, the blood-brain barrier, even our minds need structure to function." The chamber's silver veins began to glow with renewed purpose, responding to this confluence of understanding. The different traditions weren't fighting, separate battles. They were all part of humanity's fundamental need for a reality that made sense. "No!" Blackwood's shadow form expanded in desperation. "The masters offer freedom from all constraints. Why do you cling to your chains?" "Because without constraints, nothing has meaning," Sarah answered, raising her father's blade. "Without boundaries, without distinction, there can be no beauty, no purpose, no love. Even your masters understand this. Why else would they seek to impose their version of reality on ours?" The 3 guardian blades moved in perfect synchronization now, their light creating patterns that spoke of harmony through distinction. Above ground, the town's inhabitants found themselves remembering moments that defined their lives, choices made, boundaries respected, the quiet dignity of living in an ordered world. Rachel's blade traced symbols that merged with the chamber's ancient wards. The first peoples knew that power comes not from breaking boundaries, but from understanding why they exist. Kenshin's movements added layers of meaning to these patterns. Every tradition, every culture finds its own way to the same truth, that existence requires definition. The master's manifestation reached a critical point, reality stretching to its absolute limit. But now they faced something they hadn't expected, not just three guardians, but an entire town, unconsciously united in defense of ordered existence. The battle for Crow's Pass had become something larger, a testament to humanity's deep understanding that true freedom comes not from unlimited possibility, but from the meaningful choices made possible by necessary boundaries. The alliance between different traditions, different ways of understanding, and the collective will of ordinary people had created something new, a defense against chaos that drew strength from diversity rather than uniformity. The final confrontation was about to begin, and its outcome would depend on this unprecedented unity of purpose. The chamber erupted into pure chaos as the masters of the Shadow Court made their final push against reality's thinning walls. Impossible geometries twisted through space-time, while colors that shouldn't exist flared in patterns that threatened to drive observers mad. But the combined light of three guardian blades, strengthened by the collective will of Crow's Pass, held firm. "Now!" Sarah called out, raising her father's blade. "The silver ore, the pendant, the symbols, they're all parts of the same pattern. A pattern of harmony through distinction." Kenshin and Rachel moved in perfect synchronization, their blades tracing symbols that intertwined with Sarah's. Where their powers merged, reality itself seemed to crystallize, becoming more defined, rather than less. The shadow beings howled in frustration as their fluid forms were forced into more concrete states. The boundaries strengthened. Rachel's voice carried ancient power, not through separation, but through conscious choice to maintain necessary distinctions. Above ground, the town's inhabitants felt something stir in their collective consciousness. Every person who had ever appreciated the difference between day and night, between right and wrong, between love and hate, they all contributed to reinforcing the boundaries between what was and what could be. Blackwood's shadow form writhed. In denial, the masters cannot be contained. They are infinite possibility itself, and that's precisely why they need boundaries. Kenshin responded, his blade cutting through layers of reality. Without limitation, infinite possibility becomes infinite meaninglessness. The masters of the Shadow Court manifested fully now, their true forms threatening to break through into normal space-time. They were vast beyond comprehension, geometries that existed in more dimensions than the human mind could process. But with their full manifestation came a crucial vulnerability. They could now be affected by the very boundaries they sought to destroy. Sarah felt her father's presence in every symbol on her blade, in every pattern encoded in the silver ore. William Carter hadn't just discovered how to strengthen the boundaries, he'd found a way to make them self-reinforcing through the natural patterns of human consciousness. "The town's layout," she called out, understanding flowing through her. "The daily routines, the paths people walk, they're all part of it. Every time someone chooses order over chaos, meaning over infinite possibility, they strengthen the boundaries." The three guardian blades moved in complex patterns now, their light creating a web of defined reality that pushed back against the master's chaos. Old Tom's lantern light and Doc Morrison's medical knowledge added their own kinds of order to the pattern, proof that every form of human understanding helped maintain the boundaries between worlds. "You cannot defeat infinite possibility." Blackwood's voice carried desperate rage. "The masters are everything that could be." "But we don't want everything that could be," Sarah responded, her blade blazing with newfound purpose. "We want what is, what's real, what has meaning, because it's distinct and defined." The chamber's silver veins pulsed with power as the three traditions of boundary maintenance came together in perfect harmony. Eastern wisdom about balance, Native American understanding of natural order, and Western dedication to understanding patterns, all of them working together to reinforce reality itself. The masters pushed against this unified defense with power that could reshape worlds, but they found themselves confronting something they hadn't expected, the fundamental human need for a reality that made sense. Every mind that chose to believe in cause and effect, in the distinction between self and other, in the beauty of defined existence, became part of the pattern, strengthening the boundaries. "Your father understood," Kenshin said to Sarah as their blades wove reality back together. "The boundaries aren't maintained by force or ancient magic alone. They're maintained by consciousness itself, choosing to believe in a world of meaningful distinctions." The shadow beings began to fade as their master's manifestation faltered. The impossible geometries twisted back upon themselves, forced to confront the paradox of their own existence, that even chaos needs some form of definition to exist at all. "The pattern completes itself," Rachel called out, her blade adding layers of natural law to the strengthening boundaries. "Not through domination, but through harmony. Not through separation, but through conscious distinction." The final confrontation reached its peak as three guardian blades, powered by three traditions and supported by an entire town's unconscious choice of ordered reality, pushed back against the infinite chaos of the Shadow Court's masters. The very nature of existence hung in the balance, but now the defenders of reality had something the Chaos Lords could never understand: the power of conscious choice to maintain meaningful boundaries. The chamber blazed with light that spoke of definition, of distinction, of the profound beauty found in choosing what is over what could be. The battle for Crow's Pass had become a battle for the very concept of meaningful existence itself. As the final surge of power from the three guardian blades pushed back the chaos of the Shadow Court's masters, reality itself seemed to take a deep breath and settle. The impossible geometries retreated, not destroyed, but contained within properly maintained boundaries. The chamber's silver veins pulsed with renewed strength, their patterns now part of a larger, more harmonious whole. Sarah lowered her father's blade, watching as the glowing symbols along its length settled into a steady, peaceful rhythm. "It's different now, isn't it?" she said. "The boundaries, they're not just barriers anymore." "They never were," Kenshin replied, his ancient eyes taking in the transformed chamber. "What your father discovered, what you helped complete, was the understanding that boundaries are agreements between worlds, between traditions, between every conscious mind that chooses to believe in ordered reality." The shadow beings that had once been Harrison's gang had changed too. Without their master's chaos to sustain them, they had been forced to accept certain limitations. Their forms were still fluid, but now contained within natural boundaries, like water accepting the shape of its container. "We were wrong." Blackwood's voice had lost its otherworldly resonance, becoming something almost human. "We thought breaking all boundaries would bring ultimate freedom. But without boundaries, nothing can truly exist." Rachel completed the thought. "Even chaos needs some form of definition to have meaning." Above ground, Crow's Pass was awakening to a new day, though its inhabitants would never fully understand what had transpired in the mines below. Yet something had changed in the town's very fabric. The streets seemed more purposeful, the buildings more harmoniously arranged, as if the patterns of daily life had aligned themselves with deeper truths about the nature of reality. Old Tom emerged from the chamber first, his lantern light now just one of many natural boundaries between light and shadow. "William would be proud," he said to Sarah. He always said this town had something special about it. Turns out he was right, just not in the way any of us expected. Doc Morrison followed, his medical bag clutched tight. The miner's symptoms, they're fading, as if whatever was bleeding through from elsewhere has found its proper place. Again. Because it has, Kenshin explained, his sword now sheathed but still humming with quiet power. The boundaries between worlds aren't just stronger now, they're more properly aligned, like a body whose systems have found their natural balance. Sarah studied her father's journal with new understanding. Every page, every diagram, every careful observation, they were all parts of a larger vision. William Carter hadn't just been trying to protect the boundaries. He'd been working to evolve them, to show how they could be maintained through harmony rather than conflict. The three traditions, she said thoughtfully. They're going to stay united now, aren't they? Working together instead of separately. Rachel nodded, her blade catching the first rays of dawn filtering down through the mine shaft. As they were always meant to be, Eastern wisdom, native understanding, Western knowledge, each maintaining its distinct nature while contributing to a greater whole. The former shadow beings, now transformed into something neither fully human nor entirely other, approached Sarah cautiously. "What becomes of us?" Blackwood asked, his form shifting between states but never breaking its new boundaries. "You become what you truly are," Sarah replied, remembering patterns from her father's notes. "Guardians of the spaces between, maintaining the boundaries from both sides. That's what you were always meant to be, before the masters twisted your purpose." The morning sun rose fully over Crow's Pass, its light reaching even into the deepest chamber through silver veins that now served as conduits for natural power. The town above would continue its daily routines, its inhabitants unconsciously, participating in the maintenance of reality's boundaries through their simple choices and actions. "And now?" Old Tom asked, looking at the three guardians and their glowing blades. "What happens to our town?" "It becomes what it always was," Kenshin said softly. "A place where different traditions can coexist, where boundaries are maintained through understanding rather than force, a model for what William Carter knew was possible." Sarah sheathed her father's blade, feeling its power pulse in harmony with the silver pendant at her throat. The boundaries between worlds had been tested and transformed, emerging stronger not through rigid separation, but through the conscious choice to maintain necessary distinctions while acknowledging deeper connections. Crow's Pass would never be the same, but perhaps that had been William Carter's plan all along, to show that true balance comes not from fighting chaos, but from understanding why boundaries matter, and choosing to maintain them through wisdom rather than fear. The new day had brought more than just sunlight to the small mining town. It had brought understanding of a fundamental truth, that reality itself is maintained not by walls between worlds, but by the conscious choice of every mind that believes in the profound beauty of meaningful existence. 1 month after the confrontation, in the mines, Crow's Pass had settled into a new kind of existence. On the surface, little had changed. Miners still worked their claims, merchants still traded goods, and the saloon still served its whiskey. But beneath this ordinary facade, the town had become something extraordinary. Sarah walked down the main street, her father's blade now a comfortable weight at her hip. The silver veins in the mines below pulsed with steady power, no longer containing reality, but helping to define it. The former shadow beings, led by Blackwood, had taken up their new role as guardians of the spaces between, maintaining boundaries from both sides. "The morning patrol is done," Blackwood reported, his form now a harmonious blend of shadow and substance. Where once he had sought to destroy all boundaries, he now understood their necessity. The boundaries are stable, strengthening themselves through the town's natural patterns. The transformation of the shadow beings had been perhaps the most profound change. They had learned that true freedom wasn't found in the absence of boundaries, but in the conscious choice to maintain them. Their fluid forms now served as living examples of how distinction and definition gave existence its meaning. Kenshin and Rachel had established a training ground behind Old Tom's saloon, where they taught new guardians from all three traditions. The ways of the sword, the understanding of natural law, and the wisdom of maintaining reality's boundaries were no longer kept separate. Each tradition maintained its distinct nature while contributing to a greater whole. "Your father's vision grows stronger every day," Kenshin said as Sarah joined them for the morning's lessons. "Each person who chooses to maintain order over chaos, meaning over infinite possibility, adds to the strength of the boundaries." Doc Morrison had transformed his clinic into a place of both healing and understanding. His medical knowledge now incorporated insights from all three traditions, treating not just physical ailments, but the subtle disturbances that could weaken reality's fabric. His careful documentation of the relationship between physical and metaphysical health had become invaluable to the next generation of guardians. The town itself had become a model of what William Carter had foreseen, a place where different traditions could coexist while maintaining their distinct nature. The daily patterns of life, from the paths people walk to the ways they organize their activities, all contributed to the natural maintenance of reality's boundaries. Sarah stood at the mine entrance, looking down into depths that no longer held terror. The silver veins glowed with steady purpose, their patterns now part of a larger design that spoke of harmony through conscious distinction. Her father's journal, filled with careful observations and profound insights, had become a guide for future guardians. "We maintain the boundaries not through force," she told her students, a mix of young apprentices from all three traditions, but through understanding why they matter. Every choice to embrace meaning over chaos, distinction over confusion, adds to their strength, The silver ore that had revealed the truth about the boundaries had been fashioned into tokens of office for the new guardians. Each piece contained symbols from all three traditions, a physical reminder that the strongest boundaries were those maintained through unity rather than division. Old Tom had expanded his saloon to include a library of boundary law where knowledge from all traditions was preserved and studied. The walls were lined with maps showing the silver veins patterns, medical texts documenting reality's effects on human consciousness, and ancient scrolls describing the first establishment of the boundaries. The sun set over Crow's Pass, casting long shadows that behaved exactly as shadows should. In the spaces between light and dark, between what was and what could be, the town had found its true purpose, not just as a mining settlement, but as a living example of how reality itself is maintained through the conscious choice to believe in a world that makes sense. And somewhere, in the harmony between Eastern wisdom, native understanding, and Western knowledge, William Carter's legacy lived on, not just in the blade his daughter carried or the boundaries she helped maintain, but in the profound truth he had discovered, that the strongest walls between worlds are built not of force or fear, but of understanding and choice. Crow's Pass had become more than just a town. It had become a testament to the power of conscious choice, a reminder that reality itself is maintained not through rigid separation, but through the willing acceptance of necessary distinctions that give existence its meaning. The boundaries between worlds remained strong, not because they were impenetrable, but because every mind that chose, ordered reality over infinite chaos, helped to maintain them. As night fell and the stars emerged above Crow's Pass, their light reflecting off the silver veins that ran through the town's foundations, Sarah knew that her father's work, and the work of all guardians would continue. For as long as people chose to believe in a world that made sense, the boundaries would endure, protecting not just this reality, but the very concept of meaningful existence itself.